I never thought I'd find the truth behind the blood-stained letter on the kitchen counter, staring back at me like some cruel joke. But there it was, quit your job or leave this family. My hands trembled, and my chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of betrayal I had only just begun to understand. My name is Maren Delacroix. I'm 34, and I spent the better part of a decade trying to hold a life together that wasn't mine. Pieces scattered across a marriage that had been rotting beneath polite smiles and stiff dinners. I grew up in Cleveland, working double shifts at a boutique marketing firm, always believing that loyalty and sacrifice meant love, until I realized I had been chained to a family who cared more about appearances than the woman who had kept them whole. That night, the rain was slashing against the windows of our suburban home, the kind of rain that felt like it was crying with me, or maybe it was warning me. My husband, Graham, had been distant for months, hiding calls, soft laughs, and secret meetings, all while I pretended not to notice. My in-laws, who had practically raised him, whispered about retirement plans and old grudges, as though I weren't in the room, as though I didn't exist. I had always been polite, the good wife, the attentive daughter-in-law, the one who smiled while swallowing humiliation, but that letter changed everything. It wasn't just words on paper. It was a command, a dare, a challenge I never asked for but was going to accept in my own way. I stood there, staring at the words, my heart hammering with a dangerous combination of fear and exhilaration. I remembered my mother, long gone, telling me that life never gives fair fights, only the chance to fight smart. And fight I would. Every betrayal, every whispered insult, every smirk that had been thrown in my direction suddenly became fuel, a blazing heat inside me that I had never tapped into before. I thought of my own sister, who had warned me about the Delacroix family's reputation for cruelty veiled as civility. She had said, they'll never see you coming, and when you hit, it'll be like they were never even alive to hurt you. I had laughed then, thinking she was exaggerating, but now her words echoed in my mind like a prophecy. My apartment, where I had fled earlier that day after a particularly vicious dinner, suddenly seemed too small, too fragile for the storm that had been gathering inside me for years. I could feel the weight of every suppressed tear, every sleepless night, every morning spent pretending everything was okay, when nothing was. I imagined standing at the threshold of that suburban nightmare, with Graham's smug face etched in my memory, his hand on my mother-in-law's shoulder, as if he owned my submission, and I knew I would no longer be afraid. I remembered the first time I had felt truly alive, riding my motorcycle along the coast of Oregon, wind tearing through my hair, laughter spilling out of me as if my lungs had never worked properly before. And I realized that same exhilaration could be mine again, but this time aimed at those who had tried to cage me. Every ounce of me wanted revenge. Not reckless, not foolish, but sharp, precise, elegant, the kind that left scars they could not pretend were imaginary. I began making a mental list. Graham, the in-laws, the family friends who had sneered behind my back, the neighbors who had witnessed everything yet said nothing. I would turn their world upside down, piece by piece, exposing the rot they had carefully hidden. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to my closest friend, Leora, my confidant and accomplice in 1,000 minor rebellions, telling her to come over, fast. She arrived 30 minutes later, hair wet from the rain, eyes wide but trusting, because she knew that when I had a plan, it wasn't idle chatter. It was a storm about to hit. We poured coffee into chipped mugs, and I laid out the strategy, every detail, every contingency. Leora didn't flinch, didn't ask if I was sure. I knew she would stand by me no matter what, and that knowledge alone steadied the shaking in my hands. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had already begun the first phase, planting doubts, gathering evidence, recording every subtle act of betrayal that had been meticulously hidden from the world. I thought about my life before Graham, before the smothering expectations of his family, and I realized I had been living in shadows, a ghost in the home of people too blind or selfish to notice me. But no more. That night, as the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, I felt a clarity I had never known. I would not just survive. I would claim the power that had always been denied to me. I would make them remember my name, not as the quiet, compliant wife, but as Maren Delacroix, the woman who rose from the ashes of humiliation to take control of her destiny. And as I stood there, staring into the living room window, where shadows of my past whispered like ghosts, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, every sound that had once been ordinary now carried the weight of possibility, of action, of reckoning. I could almost see the scene as it would unfold. Shocked faces, whispered apologies that would never be enough, and the satisfying taste of justice served cold, precise, and deserved. But before I could move another step, before I could let the first wave of my plan begin, I heard it, the soft click of the front door unlocking from the inside. Someone was coming home. And in that instant, the adrenaline surged through me, sharper than any fear I had ever known, because I realized that tonight, nothing would go according to plan. And yet, somehow, that was exactly what I needed. Stay with me, because the next chapter will show you how I turned the tables in ways they never, ever imagined. Don't forget to subscribe to follow my story. I promise you this is only the beginning. I still remember the night Graham's betrayal became undeniable, long before the blood-stained letter, before the threats and whispered ultimatums that had poisoned our home. It was 2 years ago, a July evening, the air heavy with humidity and the kind of tension you could slice through with a knife. I had come home early from a late client meeting, exhausted and hungry, only to find the smell of expensive perfume lingering in the hallway, something floral and sharp that didn't belong to me. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a neighbor, a delivery woman, but then I saw the shadow in our bedroom. The silhouette of a woman I didn't recognize moving across the sheets as Graham fumbled with his shirt, startled by my arrival. My voice caught in my throat, disbelief freezing my limbs. And when he looked at me, that smug, guilty smirk he thought I would ignore, something inside me broke. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, staring as the world around me collapsed in slow motion. 4 months after, I replayed the image over and over, searching for answers, for the moment I might have missed, wondering if there had been signs I ignored, laughter he tried to stifle, phone calls that went unanswered, the way he always avoided my mother's gaze. I realized then that love could be a weapon, a trap designed to make you blind, and I had been ensnared. That night, as I poured my soul into silent tears, I vowed I would never be helpless again, that no one would ever dictate my life or humiliate me without consequence. I began documenting everything, text messages, receipts, whispers caught in voicemail, pictures of meetings, casual glances that weren't so casual. Each piece was a seed, and slowly, carefully, I planted a garden of truth that would one day bloom into revenge. My friends noticed the change, subtle at first, the way I held my head higher, smiled less, listened more, observed the small cracks in the facade of those around me. Leora was the first to see it. Her eyes narrowing the night I invited her over, showing her the evidence, my voice trembling with fury barely contained, yet laced with precision. We plotted quietly, meticulously, setting milestones that no one would anticipate, always staying one step behind the predators disguised as family. I also began reshaping my own life, quietly paying off debts, investing my money, learning the law, attending self-defense classes, everything to ensure that when the time came, I wouldn't just react. I would dominate legally, socially, and psychologically. The house itself became a stage, the familiar rooms turning into a labyrinth where secrets could be hidden, traps laid, and observations noted. I learned Graham's habits. When he left for work, the times he met her, the way he laughed at the in-laws' jokes without thinking, how they too were complicit in ignoring my existence. And slowly, I began to understand the patterns of control, the web of manipulation that had kept me caged. That July night, my betrayal had felt like the end, but in truth, it was only the beginning, a spark in a powder keg that had been smoldering for years. Every dinner where I had laughed politely, every holiday I endured, every compliment turned into condescension had added fuel to the fire. I remember sitting at my desk late one night, lit only by the soft glow of my laptop, researching ways to expose infidelity, protect myself financially, and gain the upper hand without endangering my reputation. I realized that revenge wasn't just about anger. It was about power, leverage, patience, and timing. I had been taught to fear confrontation, to smile and nod, to let men take the lead. But now I was rewriting the rules quietly, deliberately crafting a strategy that would leave them stunned, unable to recover, forever changed. I began talking to old colleagues, discreetly probing for insights into Graham's investments, business contacts, and even his family's hidden scandals, collecting tiny fragments of information that would later fit together like a deadly puzzle. Each discovery brought a rush of adrenaline, the taste of justice lingering on my tongue before a plan was even fully formed. And as the weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle shifts in myself, confidence replacing hesitation, strategy overtaking fear, and a dark satisfaction whenever I imagined the look on Graham's face when everything came crashing down. The house that once felt like a cage now felt like a chessboard. Every conversation, every glance, every smile or frown carefully analyzed, cataloged, and used as a tool in the game I had suddenly mastered. My in-laws' whispers about retirement funds, hidden assets, and inheritance plans no longer intimidated me. They were just data points, waiting to be leveraged. I realized that my anger, once raw and uncontrolled, could be weaponized in ways that were beautiful in their precision, terrifying in their inevitability. I started small, leaving subtle hints of knowledge in conversations, planting questions that made them squirm, watching carefully as their composure cracked under pressure I had created without lifting a finger. It was intoxicating, the power I had discovered within myself, and the knowledge that every step I took was irreversible, every move calculated to ensure they never saw it coming. I learned to blend invisibility with influence, to speak softly while commanding attention, to smile while plotting devastation that would be both righteous and satisfying. Each encounter, each dinner, each family gathering became a rehearsal, a testing ground, a way to sharpen my skills while staying under the radar. I had never felt more alive, more in control, more dangerous, and yet never so calm, because I knew the storm I was building would arrive precisely when it needed to, and when it did, nothing would be left the same. And then came the night that changed everything again. The anniversary of our wedding, a night meant for celebration, turned into a theater for my observation, as Graham drank too much, laughed too loud, and revealed too much. I watched as old friends and family slipped in their remarks, unguarded, leaving breadcrumbs that only someone paying attention would notice. My plan was beginning to converge, little threads from years of careful planning coming together in ways even I hadn't fully anticipated. I could feel it, the edge of the knife, metaphorical yet sharp, poised to cut through the lies, the pretenses, the facade of civility that had always protected Graham and his family. And just as I thought the night could not become more intense, I caught movement in the shadows of the hall, a silhouette that didn't belong to any of the expected guests, someone watching me, smiling. And I realized in that instant that my revenge might not be mine alone, that an unexpected player had entered the game, someone with their own reasons for wanting Graham's world to crumble. My heart skipped, adrenaline spiked, and I knew that the next steps would require more cunning than I had ever used before. I had learned patience, strategy, and control, but the unexpected always carried danger. And danger had never been my enemy. It had been my ally. And so I stood there, glass of champagne trembling in my hand, smiling at Graham as he boasted to friends about achievements that now seemed hollow. And I realized that tonight, everything would change forever, for all of us, in ways no one could have predicted. The night of Graham's betrayal had been only the first spark. The real fire started weeks later, the kind of fire that burns slowly, consuming everything from the inside before anyone notices the smoke. I had moved back into my apartment, claiming I needed space, but in truth, I was building my arsenal. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was scheming, watching, learning, and preparing for the day when every slight, every betrayal, every whispered insult would have its reckoning. I started with small, almost invisible acts of sabotage, subtle changes to bills, casual mentions of my awareness to mutual friends, planting doubts about Graham's behavior without revealing too much. Every interaction became a test, every smile a weapon, every compliment a calculated distraction. I traced his movements, memorized his schedule, noted the times he laughed at another woman's jokes with the same inflection he had once used to charm me. I spent hours poring over legal documents, divorce law, financial statements, looking for loopholes that would allow me to gain power without appearing vindictive. My friendships became intelligence networks, subtle conversations uncovering secrets that Graham and his family assumed were invisible. I even enrolled in a negotiation course at night, learning the art of persuasion and leverage, knowing that the more educated and precise I was, the more devastating my moves would be. One evening, I discovered a discrepancy in Graham's accounts, an offshore account he hadn't mentioned, filled with money he thought I would never find. My pulse raced, but I kept my calm. Knowledge was more intoxicating than any rage, and in that moment, I felt unstoppable. Leora, my accomplice and anchor, began helping me monitor interactions, sending me updates about the family's routines, subtle mentions of inheritance talks, retirement gifts, and hidden investments. Together, we wove a map of vulnerabilities that was becoming impossibly intricate, precise, and deadly. Then came the social gatherings, the dinners, the polite smiles hiding contempt. And I realized that the same family who had tried to cage me now walked into a trap of their own making. I began leaving small, intentional clues. An email sent to the wrong person, a text casually shown to the wrong eyes, watching the panic ripple beneath the surface as Graham struggled to maintain control of a reality he no longer commanded. At work, I was meticulous, ensuring my career flourished even as I dismantled my home life, gaining confidence and financial independence, which only sharpened the sting of my revenge. Every conversation, every casual glance, every remark was calculated, a thread pulling Graham, the in-laws, and their friends closer to the edge without them realizing it. The knowledge of his affair became a weapon, a silent accusation that I wielded subtly, letting suspicion seep into every interaction until they couldn't distinguish fact from fear. I remember one night in particular, standing in my apartment, sipping red wine as rain rattled against the window, watching Graham's social media posts, and realizing just how blind he had been. He thought the world was as small as his lies, as controllable as his charm, and I felt a thrill knowing that soon his world would shatter. And yet, even in the midst of this plotting, there were moments when the sorrow returned, quiet and insistent, whispering reminders of all I had lost: trust, love, companionship. I allowed myself those moments only briefly, using them to sharpen my resolve. The betrayal had carved out a space in me that demanded action, and I filled it with strategy, intelligence, and patience. I started documenting everything more rigorously: photos, recordings, notes about interactions, even casual remarks overheard in restaurants or while running errands. Each piece was a puzzle, and as I assembled it, I began seeing the big picture, the totality of Graham's deception, the complicity of those around him, and the perfect points of leverage. Leora often reminded me to breathe, to slow down, but I knew better. Patience was my weapon, and timing was everything. Then came the night I first tested my plan, a minor but critical maneuver. I accidentally let Graham overhear a conversation about his offshore account, gauging his reaction. The subtle shift in his demeanor, the tension tightening his jaw, the quick glance toward the door, all confirmed that my observations had penetrated the armor he thought impenetrable. That night, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had known, but also the dangerous thrill of playing a game with stakes so high they could destroy me if I misstepped. Weeks passed, each day a careful blend of normalcy and strategy, until one evening I received a call from someone I never expected, an old friend of Graham's, someone with grudges of their own, offering information that could accelerate my plan exponentially. I was cautious, knowing that alliances with unpredictable players could backfire, but the potential was irresistible. I arranged a discreet meeting, and as I sat in a dimly lit cafe, listening to the whispered confessions and secret histories, I realized that Graham's world was more fragile than I had imagined. Every betrayal he had committed, every lie he had told, every subtle manipulation was a thread waiting to be pulled. That night, the pieces began to fall into place like a masterful game of chess. And yet, as thrilling as the knowledge was, it also brought danger. Someone else now knew, and trust became a fragile commodity, something I had to manage with precision. My mind raced with possibilities, contingencies, and the knowledge that one misstep could turn the hunter into the hunted. I realized I was no longer simply reacting. I was orchestrating, directing a performance where everyone thought they were in control, and only I held the script. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and liberating all at once. The more I planned, the more I understood the extent of my own transformation, from the scared, compliant wife to a woman who could strike with precision, intelligence, and unwavering determination. And then the first tangible move came. I intercepted a conversation that Graham believed private, exposing his lies in a way that seemed accidental, leaving him bewildered and suspicious, but unable to trace the origin. The thrill of watching his confidence erode, of seeing cracks appear in the perfect facade he had built, was unlike anything I had experienced. I realized then that revenge wasn't simply a reaction. It was an art, a delicate blend of timing, psychology, and control. And as I sat there that night, reviewing notes, observing Graham from a distance, I felt the first true sense of empowerment I had ever known. I knew the end game was still far away, that the most devastating moves were yet to come, but for the first time, I was in command. And as I glanced at the rain-slicked streets outside, shadows dancing in the dim light, I sensed that someone was watching me. Not a threat, but a signal that the game had become larger than I anticipated. My heart pounded with excitement and fear because I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next phase of my plan would force everyone involved into a reckoning they never imagined. And in that instant, I understood that my journey of revenge was no longer just personal, it was inevitable, unstoppable, and about to become irreversible. The night I decided to make my first real move, I could feel the electricity in the air, sharp and alive, like it was buzzing just beneath my skin. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34. And after years of silent suffering, I was no longer the woman who smiled politely while being ignored or humiliated. I had spent countless nights mapping every detail of Graham's life, noting habits, friends, weaknesses, and secrets. I had calculated risks, anticipated reactions. And now, with Leora by my side, I was ready to strike. The target was clear, the timing perfect. Graham's work party at the country club, an event meant to showcase his success, arrogance dripping from every handshake and laugh. I arrived early, gliding through the polished hallways in a sleek black dress that whispered power, confidence, and subtle menace. Every eye turned briefly, curious, but none suspected my intention. I positioned myself strategically, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unnoticed, and began planting seeds of doubt. subtle remarks, overheard confessions, quiet questions directed to the right people. It was delicate, invisible, and devastatingly effective. I could see Graham's smile falter when he caught my eye, a flicker of unease that warmed me more than any champagne ever could. Leora and I worked seamlessly, our small gestures unnoticed, yet coordinating chaos behind the scenes, shifting attention, nudging conversations, and orchestrating minor accidents that would slowly unravel the narrative Graham had spent years constructing. I watched him closely, noticing every micro-expression, the tension in his jaw, the fleeting glance toward the exits, the way he adjusted his cufflinks as though preparing for battle without realizing it. Every guest became a pawn, unwitting participants in a game I had designed, and the thrill of control surged through me. As the night progressed, I executed small but precise actions. A name dropped into the wrong conversation, a whispered hint of truth in an innocuous chat, a private email accidentally forwarded. Each move seemed trivial on the surface, yet I could see the ripple effects, Graham's composure slipping imperceptibly as suspicion crept into his eyes. I felt a rush of exhilaration, the intoxicating power of being 2 steps ahead while maintaining an air of civility. Leora leaned close at one point, murmuring, "It's working. He's noticing the cracks." And she was right. The cracks were widening, subtle at first, but undeniable, and I could feel the anticipation building in the pit of my stomach. I had rehearsed this night in my mind countless times, imagining the perfect balance between subtlety and impact, patience and action, and now every detail was aligning. The music in the background, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all became part of the stage I had constructed, each element a tool for maximum effect. I noticed Graham leaning toward a colleague, whispering, his body language defensive, his eyes darting toward the crowd, as if sensing the invisible pressure. I smiled inwardly, knowing that even without confronting him directly, the seeds of doubt had taken root. And then came the moment that truly tested my patience and nerve. A toast, a speech Graham had rehearsed endlessly, meant to impress his peers and assert dominance. As he began, I subtly diverted attention, causing a minor technical malfunction with the microphone, just enough to rattle him, and watched as he struggled to maintain composure. His words faltered, his confidence wavered, and a small audience of colleagues exchanged glances, noting the unusual tension. I felt a thrill so sharp it left me breathless, the knowledge that my carefully laid plans were now interacting with reality, producing real, observable effects. Leora caught my eye from across the room, her silent nod confirming what I already knew. This was only the beginning. I moved closer to Graham during the commotion, ostensibly to offer help, but my presence alone added pressure, a silent reminder that I was no longer invisible, no longer the compliant wife, no longer powerless. I whispered a single word under my breath, a private signal only Leora and I understood, and within moments, the first domino fell. A colleague previously loyal to Graham mentioned an awkward detail about a project, something that revealed mismanagement, a minor crack in his facade amplified by my subtle orchestration. Graham's face drained of color, and I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered with the knowledge that more layers of strategy were necessary. I stepped back, smiling politely, mingling, allowing the night to unfold while my plan advanced imperceptibly. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered remark I orchestrated carried weight, a silent strike that Graham could neither trace nor counter. The thrill of this power, combined with the precision of my actions, was unlike anything I had experienced before, a heady mixture of fear and exhilaration that coursed through my veins. I knew I was dancing on the edge, balancing between revelation and subtlety, but I also understood that only by maintaining control could I achieve the ultimate goal, dismantling the life Graham had built on lies. By the end of the evening, I had accomplished what I had set out to do, Subtle panic had begun to ripple through his carefully curated world. Questions were forming, suspicions blossoming, and Graham's confidence was visibly eroding. I felt a sense of mastery, a quiet triumph that was almost poetic in its execution. And yet, just as I allowed myself a moment to revel in the success, I saw her, Claire, the other woman, unexpectedly present at the party, her gaze sweeping the room, landing on me with a look that mixed curiosity, recognition, and challenge. My heart skipped, adrenaline spiking in a way I hadn't anticipated. She was not part of my calculations, not a player I had considered, and her presence threatened to upend the careful equilibrium I had established. I realized instantly that this night, this carefully orchestrated first strike, was about to become infinitely more complicated. My mind raced, scanning possibilities, strategies, contingencies, all while keeping my face calm, composed, polite. Claire moved through the crowd, unaware of my awareness, yet I knew instinctively that she could be an ally or a threat. One wrong move, one glance, one whispered word, and my delicate web could unravel. I felt the weight of possibility pressing down on me. The knowledge that my first real act of revenge had been flawless so far, but now faced an unpredictable element. I glanced at Leora, who subtly shrugged, equally tense, equally aware of the sudden twist in our plan. I realized then that the game had evolved, that the night's events had shifted the battlefield, and that from this point forward, nothing could be taken for granted. My pulse quickened as I observed Claire navigating the room, subtly influencing conversations, drawing attention, her presence like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples across the carefully placid surface of Graham's world. And in that instant, I understood the true nature of revenge. It was never linear, never predictable, and never without danger. But I also understood something else, something deeper, almost intoxicating in its clarity. I had become a force to be reckoned with, precise, patient, and daring, and now, with a new variable in play, the story was far from over. I felt the thrill of the unknown, the dangerous excitement of the night stretching ahead, and I knew that when the first confrontation came, it would be unforgettable, irreversible, and devastating in ways Graham and everyone around him could never imagine. As I stood there, a glass in hand, smiles plastered across my face, and storm clouds gathering outside the windows, I realized with chilling certainty that the next moves would decide everything, and that the night had only just begun. The morning after Graham's humiliating first stumble, I felt a thrill of satisfaction, but I knew the real challenge had only begun. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and for the first time in years, I could see the patterns clearly. Graham was unraveling, but the in-laws, the family friends, and even Claire, the unexpected variable, had to be carefully managed. I spent the early hours sipping coffee in my apartment, reviewing every detail from the night before, noting micro-expressions, whispered reactions, and subtle fractures in Graham's facade. Leora arrived shortly after, her presence steadying me, and together we plotted the next moves, ensuring that each action escalated the pressure without revealing my hand. We knew Graham would attempt damage control, the kind of frantic, half-baked maneuvers that only deepen the cracks in a life built on lies. I began by leveraging his colleagues, planting doubt about his leadership and financial choices, letting gossip ripple outward subtly but strategically. By mid-morning, I had already intercepted a call meant to reassure one of Graham's friends, subtly twisting details to make him seem unreliable and reckless. I documented every reaction, knowing that these tiny victories, invisible to the casual observer, were building toward the larger storm. Then came a text from Claire, innocent on the surface, but layered with provocation. Interesting party last night. I didn't know you were aware. My pulse raced, adrenaline surging through me as I considered the possibilities. Was she a threat, an ally, or another pawn to manipulate? I chose diplomacy first, responding carefully, hinting only at knowledge I hadn't revealed, letting her wonder where my awareness truly lay. Leora reminded me that perception was a weapon as potent as evidence. And I realized she was right. Claire's uncertainty could be as valuable as her secrets. By afternoon, I was executing simultaneous moves, contacting mutual friends, sending anonymous tips about Graham's offshore account, and creating the illusion of widespread awareness that he couldn't control. Each step was like pressing a key in a symphony of chaos, notes harmonizing into a crescendo of anxiety that Graham could neither anticipate nor counter. The in-laws, oblivious to the forces converging around them, continued their patronizing routines, discussing retirement plans and estate strategies, unaware that I was mapping their vulnerabilities with surgical precision. I found joy in the quiet moments when they unknowingly exposed secrets, oversharing their assumptions about my ignorance, and I filed every word for later use. That evening, I decided it was time to test Graham's resilience further. I arranged a chance encounter at a local restaurant, choosing a neutral public space where he would feel observed yet unprepared. I arrived early, selecting a table with a clear view of the entrance and all surrounding activity, and ordered strategically, letting subtle gestures communicate awareness without words. When Graham arrived, accompanied by Claire and a friend, I smiled, polite yet piercing, and noticed immediately the way his eyes darted nervously. The tension was palpable. His attempt at casual conversation faltered under my quiet scrutiny. I allowed small, calculated pauses, letting questions hang just long enough to provoke discomfort, and observed as his composure eroded incrementally. Claire noticed too, her subtle glances confirming that she recognized the shift, yet she didn't retreat, an unpredictable variable, but one I could exploit. Midway through dinner, I introduced an offhand remark about a project he had mishandled, phrased as a casual observation, and watched as panic flickered across his face. His attempts to deflect were clumsy, revealing inconsistencies that I mentally cataloged for future leverage. By dessert, Graham was sweating under the polite interrogation of invisible forces I had orchestrated, unaware that every detail he revealed would be used strategically. I left before the evening ended, letting the ripples of unease continue in my absence, knowing that absence can be as powerful a tool as presence. Back in my apartment, Leora and I debriefed, analyzing every word, gesture, and reaction, celebrating subtle victories, and planning the next phase. I realized that revenge, when executed with patience and intelligence, was an intoxicating force, a power that made every past humiliation, every stolen moment, every tear shed in silence worthwhile. And yet, even as I reveled in these triumphs, I knew the real challenge loomed. Graham would eventually sense the web closing around him, and the in-laws, protective and calculating, would attempt to regain control. I began laying contingencies for every predictable reaction, anticipating arguments, alliances, and desperate attempts at damage control. I even started planting evidence of my own, small breadcrumbs that hinted at knowledge of his secrets, designed to provoke him into action while ensuring the perception of control remained mine. Days turned into weeks, and the tension I orchestrated continued to escalate. I watched Graham's confidence deteriorate, noted the subtle fear in his interactions, and observed the in-laws' growing frustration. Claire remained a wild card, her motives unclear, but I began subtly guiding her involvement, planting small seeds of alignment with my goals while keeping her dependent on my information. My dual life, balancing career, revenge, and emotional control, became a thrilling exercise in strategy and patience. Every social interaction was a chess move, every casual conversation a potential advantage, and every private observation a new opportunity to shift the balance. I discovered a strange clarity in this orchestration, a focus I had never known, where emotion became a tool rather than a weakness. Then came the day that shifted everything, an unexpected invitation to a weekend retreat at Graham's family estate. ostensibly for a family bonding event, but I saw it for what it truly was, a test of control, a chance to assert dominance over everyone involved. I accepted, knowing that this environment, enclosed and familiar, would be the perfect stage for the next act. Leora and I meticulously planned our approach, considering every scenario, anticipating every defensive maneuver from Graham and his allies, and preparing contingencies for Claire's unpredictable presence. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was the opportunity. On the first night of the retreat, I positioned myself strategically, observing interactions, noting alliances, and carefully manipulating the flow of conversation to create tension and unease. Every subtle glance, every whispered remark, every carefully timed question was orchestrated to expose weaknesses and erode the facades that had protected Graham for so long. By midnight, the first significant cracks began to show. Alliances faltered, suspicions spread, and Graham, once confident and commanding, appeared increasingly vulnerable, fumbling with explanations and deflections. I felt a surge of exhilaration, the intoxicating power of control mingling with the knowledge that my long-planned strategy was coming to fruition. Yet, just as I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, I noticed a shadow moving across the veranda, someone observing me with intent, someone whose motives were unclear. And I realized in that instant that the next phase of my plan would not only challenge Graham, but could also bring unforeseen complications from a player I hadn't yet accounted for. The night stretched ahead, tense, electric, and filled with possibility, and I knew that every decision, every gesture, every whispered word would shape the path of my revenge, setting the stage for the confrontation that would change everything. The retreat stretched into the second day, thick with tension, quiet glances, and hidden agendas, and I realized that every move I made now had to be flawless. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and I had never felt more alive, more focused, or more dangerous. The first night had been a test, revealing fissures in Graham's confidence and exposing subtle weaknesses in the in-laws' defenses. But now the stage was set for decisive action. I spent the morning walking the grounds, observing interactions, noting alliances, cataloging every gesture, every glance, every word exchanged with surgical precision. Leora followed discreetly, whispering observations and suggestions, her presence a stabilizing force in a game that could spiral out of control with a single misstep. I began orchestrating conversations, introducing carefully chosen topics that would provoke unease, all while maintaining the facade of polite compliance. Graham's arrogance was evident, yet fragile. He flinched subtly at my pointed remarks, his smiles forced, his laughter hollow. I let his friends overhear half-truths, designed to sow doubt without revealing my hand, and watched as suspicion began spreading like wildfire through the carefully curated social network he had built. The in-laws, who had always considered themselves the architects of my life, revealed vulnerabilities in their own conversations, slips, offhand comments, and assumptions that I carefully recorded. I could see Claire observing me, calculating, curious, yet, for the first time, slightly off balance, uncertain of her role. By midday, I initiated the first controlled confrontation, a chance meeting in the library where I subtly guided the conversation to topics Graham feared most, his finances, his credibility, and the fragile trust of his colleagues. His face tightened, eyes darting, every gesture betraying anxiety he tried desperately to mask. Leora watched from a distance, confirming the subtle victory, while I allowed my own composure to remain serene, calculated, almost regal. Each carefully planted remark, each invisible hint chipped away at Graham's control, and I could see it. The first tremors of panic, the unraveling of confidence, the subtle but undeniable weakening of his position. By evening, the retreat had become a theater of tension, and I found myself orchestrating interactions with precision that felt almost supernatural. Claire approached, curiosity evident in her expression, and I allowed a brief smile, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us was fully transparent, that each of us held secrets the other could exploit. Together, silently, we became agents of disruption, and I realized that even allies could be manipulated with the right cues. I carefully guided conversations toward sensitive subjects, ensuring that Graham and the in-laws felt the pressure of exposure without recognizing its origin. Every gesture, every word, every subtle movement became a weapon in the art of revenge I had been perfecting for months. I noticed Graham retreating at times, seeking refuge in alcohol, fumbling with explanations, and I allowed it, letting him destabilize himself while I remained calm, focused, untouchable. By nightfall, the first tangible cracks had become evident. Whispers, suspicious glances, and minor conflicts erupted, all orchestrated without direct confrontation. I felt the thrill of mastery, the intoxicating sensation of holding invisible strings that moved people like pieces on a chessboard. And yet, even as I celebrated these victories internally, I understood that the real challenge was imminent. The in-laws, protective and calculating, would begin aggressive interventions if Graham appeared too vulnerable. I needed to stay 2 steps ahead, anticipating their moves, while amplifying the chaos subtly, invisibly. Midway through the evening, I executed the most delicate maneuver, yet planting fabricated but plausible evidence of Graham's mismanagement in a place where the in-laws would discover it, ensuring they would confront him directly while I remained above suspicion. The effect was immediate. Tension flared, voices rose, and Graham's attempts to deflect only deepened suspicion. I observed silently, absorbing every reaction, every tremor of fear, every flash of realization, knowing that I had struck precisely where it would hurt most. Claire lingered nearby, her eyes wide with a mixture of respect and wariness, and I realized that her unpredictable presence had become a tool, a way to amplify Graham's instability without ever directly revealing my strategy. By the time the night drew to a close, the family dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Graham's confidence had eroded, the in-laws' control had faltered, and I remained calm, composed, untouchable, the silent architect of chaos. Leora and I retreated to my room, exhilarated but cautious, debriefing, cataloging successes, and planning the next phase with even more precision. I realized that the retreat had been a crucible, forging not only my revenge, but also my transformation into someone capable of wielding power with patience, strategy, and cold precision. And yet, the most important moves were still ahead, exposing Graham fully, ensuring he could neither recover nor retaliate, and managing Claire's unpredictable role. I knew that patience was still required, that timing remained critical, and that the next confrontation would be decisive. As I lay in bed, listening to the distant echoes of arguments and whispered suspicions, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. Graham would fall, the family would fracture, and I would emerge not as the woman they had underestimated, but as someone they could never ignore or control. The exhilaration of control mingled with the thrill of suspense, and I realized that revenge, when executed with patience and intelligence, was a force more intoxicating than fear, more potent than anger. I closed my eyes, mentally rehearsing the next steps, anticipating every possible reaction, and feeling for the first time in years the pure, unshakable power of being in command of my own destiny. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring confrontation, revelation, and irreversible change, and I was ready. The morning sun crept through the blinds like a spotlight, illuminating the intensity of what was about to unfold. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and I could feel the electricity of anticipation coursing through me, every nerve alive with the promise of revelation. The retreat had exposed cracks, destabilized Graham, and sown seeds of suspicion in the in-laws, but today would be the first major public strike, the moment when carefully orchestrated whispers became undeniable evidence. I spent the early hours reviewing every detail, photos, messages, emails and financial records, assembling the narrative with precision, ensuring nothing could be denied or rationalized away. Leora arrived with the final piece of the puzzle, a set of documents Graham believed secure, now perfectly positioned to create maximum impact. By mid-morning, I had chosen the setting, the estate's grand dining room, the heart of family gatherings, where every eye would be on Graham, every whisper noticed, every glance scrutinized. I positioned myself with calm confidence, exuding a composed elegance that contrasted with the storm I was about to unleash. As guests arrived, I subtly ensured that conversations gravitated toward topics Graham feared: investments, reputation, and personal conduct, letting questions float like invisible probes. He appeared unaware at first, joking, laughing, the fragile mask of control barely holding, but I watched carefully, waiting for the precise moment to reveal what I had meticulously gathered. Then, as dessert was cleared and attention wavered, I began casually, almost innocuously, referencing a project he had mishandled, using facts he had disclosed in private moments, now visible to the wrong ears. Murmurs spread like wildfire, eyes widening, subtle gestures betraying disbelief and concern. I followed with financial discrepancies, carefully phrased as innocent curiosity, prompting colleagues to ask questions, their tone polite but insistent. Graham's composure faltered visibly. The mask slipped, revealing the anxiety he had tried so hard to conceal. The in-laws leaned in, voices tinged with frustration and suspicion, the first seeds of confrontation sprouting naturally from the evidence I had planted. I observed silently, cataloging reactions, noting alliances and fractures, while maintaining the facade of innocent involvement. Leora, strategically positioned across the room, provided subtle reinforcement, ensuring no detail was missed and that the impact was maximized. Claire lingered nearby, her presence unpredictable, but I subtly guided her interactions, planting hints that aligned with my objectives without compromising my control. By the time I paused, the room was charged with tension. Graham was defensive, the in-laws skeptical, and whispers of betrayal and mismanagement spreading in every corner. I felt the rush of power, the intoxicating clarity of control, yet I remained composed, knowing that restraint was as powerful as revelation. I allowed a brief, calculated pause, letting the uncertainty fester, giving Graham the illusion that he might recover while the truth slowly suffocated him. Then, with a subtle gesture, I revealed the final piece, a series of messages between Graham and Claire, undeniable in their evidence, carefully curated to maximize shock without revealing my involvement. Gasps filled the room, eyes darted, and I could see the panic rising in Graham's chest, the tension in his jaw, the shallow, rapid breaths he tried to conceal. The in-laws were stunned, questioning, outraged, scrambling to understand the implications, while I remained composed, calm, and resolute, the eye of the storm I had created. Claire's eyes met mine for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of shared power and understanding, yet her uncertainty reminded me that unpredictability could be harnessed or dangerous. I observed every movement, every whispered remark, every fleeting glance, cataloging the immediate fallout and planning the next steps. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Graham's aura of control had dissipated, the in-laws' influence waned, and the room pulsed with suspicion and anxiety I had orchestrated with precision. I felt an intoxicating mixture of satisfaction, relief, and exhilaration, knowing that my first major public strike had succeeded without confrontation, yet still left room for the next phase. Even in the midst of triumph, I remained vigilant, aware that revenge was a delicate balance between timing, precision, and control, and any misstep could reverse the momentum. Leora whispered a subtle reminder, and I smiled internally, appreciating the silent acknowledgement of victory and continued strategy. That evening, as the retreat wound down, I observed Graham retreating into private spaces, isolated, defensive, and vulnerable, the first signs of complete psychological exposure. I took note, cataloged, and planned further maneuvers, understanding that momentum was my ally and hesitation my enemy. The retreat had become a crucible, revealing the weaknesses of those I targeted and amplifying my own transformation into someone capable of wielding influence, control, and power with precision. By nightfall, I knew the next moves would require both subtlety and boldness, manipulating alliances, exploiting fears, and ensuring that Graham's reputation would never recover, all while managing the unpredictable presence of Claire. I felt the weight of inevitability, the thrill of anticipation, and the intoxicating sense that the path I had chosen, though dangerous, was the only way to reclaim control, exact justice, and prove to everyone, especially Graham, that underestimating me had been their greatest mistake. And as I sat alone in my room that night, reviewing every interaction, every word, every glance, I realized that the first major strike had succeeded beyond expectation, but the final chapters, the ultimate revelation, and the absolute reckoning were still ahead, promising a confrontation that would be unforgettable, irreversible, and devastating for all involved. The days after the retreat felt charged with tension, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon, and I could sense that Graham was unraveling faster than I had anticipated. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and the thrill of seeing him falter fueled a sharp, almost intoxicating focus that sharpened my mind and sharpened my patience. I spent every morning reviewing interactions, cataloging reactions, and adjusting strategies, while Leora monitored Graham's movements, conversations, and digital footprints. Every minor slip, every nervous glance, every hushed conversation became a weapon in my arsenal. I knew that subtlety was key, too direct, and I risked backlash. Too cautious, and momentum would stall. I orchestrated casual encounters in public spaces, grocery stores, cafes, even local gyms, each designed to provoke uncertainty, to make Graham feel observed, vulnerable, and increasingly paranoid. Claire remained a wild card, her involvement unpredictable yet strategically useful. I began subtly guiding her actions, planting half-truths that would escalate tension without exposing my hand. Each day, Graham's confidence waned visibly, and I noted the smallest cracks, the quiver of his voice when questioned, the forced politeness masking irritation, the way he avoided eye contact with people he once commanded effortlessly. Leora and I devised small tests, like anonymous tips to colleagues or suggestive comments in casual conversation, all designed to magnify suspicion and pressure. By midweek, Graham was reactive, defensive, and increasingly isolated, his friends and family quietly observing fractures in his demeanor, unsure if they were imagining it. I reveled in the invisible control, feeling a potent mix of vindication and empowerment, yet remained disciplined, understanding that patience and timing were still paramount. That Thursday evening, I executed a particularly delicate maneuver, an invitation to a high-profile dinner, one that Graham could not ignore, but one where the social environment amplified tension. I arrived early, securing vantage points, ensuring subtle cues, gestures, and overheard conversations were perfectly positioned to destabilize him. Claire arrived too, her presence both unpredictable and potent. I let her observe just enough to create uncertainty, guiding her subtly, ensuring she became an amplifier rather than a threat. The dinner unfolded like a chessboard, every conversation a calculated strike, every glance a probe into Graham's psyche. I noted his responses, flinches, stammered sentences, and fleeting frustration, all signs that my influence was working, that he was beginning to understand, vaguely and fearfully, that he was no longer in control. By dessert, I escalated the pressure with a carefully timed revelation, a subtle but undeniable hint that others had been aware of Graham's financial mismanagement and private indiscretions for weeks. Murmurs rippled through the room, attention sharpened, and Graham's attempts at deflection grew clumsier with each passing moment. The in-laws were visibly shaken, questioning, doubting, and probing, yet unable to pinpoint the source or control the narrative. I remained poised, composed, a calm presence while chaos erupted subtly around me. Leora signaled discreetly that the plan was working, and I smiled inwardly, the power of invisibility in orchestration exhilarating. Claire's eyes met mine, once a silent acknowledgement of strategy and shared awareness. And I realized that even unpredictable allies could be harnessed effectively if handled carefully. By night's end, the retreat's influence extended beyond the estate. Graham's confidence had been critically weakened, the in-laws' authority challenged, and my position had shifted from observer to orchestrator of irreversible change. Returning to my room, I cataloged every interaction, every flicker of doubt, every tremor of anxiety, refining strategies for the next, more decisive phase. I understood that momentum was my ally, yet I also recognized the increasing dangers. Exposure, miscalculation, or the emergence of unforeseen variables could derail everything. Still, the thrill of being in command, the intoxicating awareness of control, propelled me forward with unwavering determination. The following morning, I executed another layer of subtle disruption, strategically timed messages, casually revealed insights to key individuals, and calibrated appearances that made Graham feel observed, scrutinized, and increasingly paranoid. Each move was invisible to the casual eye, but its impact magnified across the social ecosystem he had once dominated effortlessly. I watched, fascinated, as uncertainty took root, spreading like wildfire through his network, leaving him defensive, anxious, and isolated. Claire's role became more intriguing. I guided her with carefully chosen hints, half-truths, and subtle provocations, allowing her actions to further destabilize Graham while preserving the illusion of her independence. By mid-afternoon, Graham was visibly on edge, reacting unpredictably to minor challenges, and the in-laws, sensing instability, began maneuvering in ways that created additional pressure. I observed, cataloged, and adjusted, orchestrating interactions to maximize effect while minimizing risk. That evening, a casual dinner with extended family became a pivotal stage for escalation. I subtly directed conversations toward delicate topics, financial management, loyalty, personal accountability, ensuring that each comment, question, or observation applied incremental pressure on Graham while appearing innocuous. I noted the subtle tremors, quickened breaths, diverted gazes, tightening fists, the fragile veneer of control beginning to crumble. The in-laws were forced to confront uncomfortable truths, their usual dominance weakened, their assumptions challenged by evidence they could neither ignore nor fully understand. Claire's carefully guided presence added a layer of unpredictability, amplifying tension without revealing my hand. As the evening wore on, I observed the culmination of weeks of strategy, Graham, defensive and isolated, struggling to maintain composure, the in-laws uncertain and cautious, and myself calm, composed, fully in control of the orchestration. Leora whispered quiet affirmations, and I allowed myself a brief sense of triumph, tempered by the knowledge that the most decisive strikes were still ahead. The retreat had evolved into a stage for irreversible transformation, relationships strained, secrets exposed, and power dynamics irrevocably altered. I realized that patience, observation, and precise action had created an unstoppable momentum, one that would culminate in the confrontation and resolution I had envisioned for months. Yet even in triumph, I remained vigilant, aware that unforeseen elements, Claire the in-laws, or even Graham's own desperation, could introduce new challenges. The intoxicating mix of control, anticipation, and calculated risk coursed through me, sharpening my focus and determination. I understood, with absolute clarity, that the next phase would determine the final outcome: Graham's complete exposure, the in-laws' surrender of control, and the culmination of my long-planned, patient, and meticulous revenge. As I lay in bed that night, cataloging every detail, analyzing reactions, and envisioning next moves, I felt a sense of inevitability. The storm I had orchestrated was about to break, and when it did, the reckoning would be total, unforgettable, and irreversible. The tension in the air was palpable as I stepped into the estate's grand hall for the penultimate confrontation. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on me, each heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of a storm about to break. Graham's unease was visible the moment he entered, his posture stiff, the practiced confidence I had dismantled now replaced by subtle panic. I had spent weeks orchestrating every detail, every word, every interaction to lead to this precise moment, and I could sense that all of my preparation was converging. Leora stayed discreetly at my side, eyes sharp, ready to observe, advise, and ensure that nothing derailed the carefully constructed sequence of revelations. The in-laws gathered, a mixture of curiosity and caution in their expressions, sensing the impending shift in power dynamics. I moved deliberately confident, exuding calm, while subtly signaling to Claire, ensuring her unpredictable energy would amplify, not threaten, my control. As conversations began, I guided topics toward Graham's decisions, highlighting minor discrepancies, carefully exposing the cracks in his narrative, while allowing others to uncover the implications naturally. Colleagues and family members asked pointed questions, their tone polite yet edged with suspicion, and I observed the subtle tremors of panic in Graham's gestures, the faltering inflection in his voice, the fleeting avoidance of eye contact. Each moment built incrementally, like an invisible crescendo, until Graham's composure began to collapse under the weight of carefully orchestrated pressure. I interjected subtly, not as an accuser but as a neutral observer, asking questions that prompted him to reveal more than he intended, while ensuring that every reaction was visible to those around him. Claire, guided by my subtle cues, played her part perfectly, adding unanticipated pressure, forcing Graham to confront inconsistencies, and heightening the emotional stakes. By midday, the room was charged with tension. Whispers and glances exchanged across the hall, murmurs of disbelief, and subtle confrontations forming naturally from the seeds I had planted. I felt a thrill of power, the intoxicating clarity of control as I watched the careful choreography unfold perfectly. Yet I remained vigilant, understanding that patience was essential, and one misstep could give Graham or the in-laws an opportunity to regain control. Lunch became a critical stage, where I introduced seemingly casual but strategically timed evidence, documents, messages, and reminders of previous indiscretions, subtly guiding conversations so that Graham would confront his own mistakes under public scrutiny. The in-laws' authority was visibly undermined as they struggled to interpret and contain the unfolding revelations, while colleagues and friends processed the implications quietly but pointedly. I observed every movement, cataloging reactions, and anticipating the psychological shifts that would guide the next phase of escalation. By afternoon, Graham was visibly fraying, defensive, and reactive, struggling to navigate a social environment I had carefully manipulated to expose him completely. I guided interactions with surgical precision, allowing others to ask questions, prompting remarks, and orchestrating moments where his own responses would incriminate or undermine him. Claire, increasingly aware of my influence, subtly amplified my strategy, her unpredictable presence now a carefully harnessed force, adding tension without derailing control. As the evening approached, the first cracks of total exposure began to appear. Whispers of betrayal, questions about financial decisions, subtle confrontations, and visible unease in Graham's interactions with those he once commanded effortlessly. Leora noted each reaction, confirming the success of our carefully orchestrated campaign, and I allowed myself a quiet thrill, tempered by the awareness that the final steps required flawless execution. Dinner became the ultimate stage, where I revealed the final, irrefutable evidence, a combination of messages, documented missteps, and subtle, corroborated observations from multiple witnesses, strategically unveiled to ensure maximum impact. Gasps filled the room, glances exchanged, and Graham's composure shattered entirely, his voice faltering, explanations faltering, and attempts to deflect collapsing under scrutiny. The in-laws were forced to confront uncomfortable truths, their usual dominance neutralized, their authority weakened by the clarity of the evidence, while the room's attention focused entirely on the unraveling figure of Graham. Claire's role was instrumental, her carefully guided interventions amplifying the impact, forcing him to respond to multiple fronts simultaneously, unable to control the narrative or recover the initiative. I remained composed, calm, and observant, cataloging every detail, noting the emotional and psychological shifts, understanding that the next steps would solidify the irreversible damage. By nightfall, the Grand Hall had become a theater of exposure. Graham, isolated, defensive, and panicked, the in-laws cautious, challenged, and uncertain, and myself fully in control, orchestrating the culmination of months of careful planning. Leora whispered confirmation that the strategy had succeeded beyond expectation, and I allowed myself a quiet sense of triumph, knowing that the momentum I had created was unstoppable. Yet, I understood that the final chapter, the absolute resolution, was still ahead, requiring careful navigation, psychological mastery, and perfect timing to ensure that Graham's fall was complete and irreversible. The storm I had orchestrated had reached its peak, the air thick with anticipation, and every individual present was now a participant in the inevitable reckoning. As I prepared for the final moves, cataloging reactions, anticipating arguments, and planning contingencies, I felt the intoxicating clarity of control. The power of patience, precision, and psychological orchestration had brought me to this moment. And in that quiet awareness, I knew that the ultimate confrontation, the reckoning, the revelation, and the closure was imminent, promising a dramatic, unforgettable, and irreversible conclusion that would leave Graham and everyone involved forever altered. The night had arrived, thick with anticipation, tension, and the knowledge that every carefully orchestrated move was about to reach its culmination. My name is Maren Delacroix, 34, and I could feel the electricity of inevitability coursing through me, every nerve alive with the promise of revelation, reckoning, and vindication. Graham was present, visibly frayed, defensive, and increasingly aware that the control he had wielded for years was slipping irreversibly through his fingers. The in-laws were tense, their usual authority undermined, forced to confront uncomfortable truths, their faces tight with disbelief and confusion. Claire lingered nearby, unpredictable, yet subtly aligned with the orchestration I had carefully cultivated, adding pressure without revealing her intentions. I moved deliberately composed and exuded calm as I prepared to deliver the final, undeniable proof of Graham's duplicity, the culmination of months of observation, planning, and subtle manipulation. Every word, gesture, and glance had been calibrated for maximum impact, every whisper and half-truth strategically positioned to unravel his carefully constructed facade. The room seemed to pulse with expectation as I began to speak, narrating events with a calm authority, revealing documented messages, financial missteps, and indiscretions, each detail presented with precision and clarity. Gasps rippled through the room, whispers escalated, and Graham's attempts to explain, deflect, or charm were rendered futile by the undeniable nature of the evidence. The in-laws, colleagues, and friends were forced to absorb the reality of what had been concealed, their shock amplified by the meticulous timing, framing, and presentation I had orchestrated. Claire's carefully guided interventions subtly pushed Graham toward emotional vulnerability, exposing cracks in his composure that he could no longer conceal. I watched, exhilarated yet composed. As the power dynamics shifted irrevocably, Graham was isolated, defensive, and broken, unable to regain authority or control, while the in-laws scrambled to interpret, understand, and respond to the revelation. Every subtle move I had executed, every seed of doubt, every whisper, every glance had converged into this moment, producing a cascade of reactions that confirmed the effectiveness of months of planning. I allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of revelation settle, allowing Graham and the room to absorb the magnitude of exposure, and then continued with precision, amplifying the psychological impact by revealing the final, carefully curated pieces of evidence. The room became a theater of raw emotion. Disbelief, anger, shock, and awe mingled in the air, creating a tension that felt almost tangible. Graham's face drained of color. His defenses collapsed entirely, and the in-laws' authority, once unquestioned, was irreversibly undermined. Claire's presence, carefully harnessed, magnified the impact, her reactions visible yet controlled, reinforcing the psychological pressure I had engineered. By the time I concluded, the equilibrium had shifted completely. Graham was powerless, the in-laws were uncertain, and I stood at the center, calm, composed, and undeniably in control, the orchestrator of a reckoning that was both precise and irreversible. Leora, silently observing from the sidelines, gave a subtle nod of affirmation, and I allowed myself the faintest smile, recognizing the culmination of patience, strategy, and careful manipulation. The adrenaline coursing through me was tempered by clarity. This was the moment when months of planning, observation, and subtle orchestration manifested fully, leaving no room for denial, retaliation, or recovery. Even in the midst of triumph, I remained vigilant, aware that the final touches required careful attention, ensuring that every observer understood the magnitude of what had been revealed without suspecting the architect behind it. Graham, broken, defensive, and visibly shaken, attempted one last feeble argument, but the room's collective awareness rendered it powerless, every attempt at control or deflection extinguished by the weight of truth I had meticulously curated. The in-laws, grappling with the reality of exposure and betrayal, could only observe, their influence diminished, their authority challenged in ways that would have lasting consequences. I allowed a final gesture, subtle yet deliberate, to signal the end of my orchestration, a quiet confirmation that the dominoes had fallen exactly as I had envisioned. Claire's eyes met mine one last time, a mixture of respect, caution, and acknowledgement of shared understanding, and I realized that even unpredictable allies could be guided, controlled, and utilized with precision when strategy and patience governed every interaction. As the night drew to a close, Graham retreated, isolated and defeated, the in-laws subdued and uncertain, and I remained the silent force behind the irreversible shift in power dynamics. Leora and I left the estate, quietly cataloging reactions, observing subtle shifts in behavior, and noting the enduring impact of the orchestrated exposure. The exhilaration of control, the intoxicating clarity of precision, and the satisfaction of seeing months of careful orchestration bear fruit were overwhelming yet grounding, reinforcing the understanding that patience, strategy, and subtlety are the most powerful tools in any confrontation. I realized that revenge, when executed with patience, intelligence, and precise timing, becomes an unstoppable force, transforming vulnerability into strength and humiliation into empowerment. As I walked into the cool night air, feeling the weight of triumph, I knew that this story, our story, was a testament to resilience, strategy, and the power of reclaiming agency. And for those watching who have followed every twist, every betrayal, and every carefully orchestrated move, remember this: empowerment comes from patience, observation, and knowing precisely when to act. If you've been captivated by this journey, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next story of suspense, strategy, and dramatic revelation. The night had ended, Graham was defeated, and the world as he knew it had shifted forever, but my story and the lessons it carries were just beginning to resonate, leaving an echo of power, precision, and vindication that would linger long after the final word was spoken.